So I'm ready to start sewing my mask, and I have my lining cut and my facing fabric cut, and I've put my fabrics right side to right side as instructed in the packet. So there's the correct side of the fabric. You can see this is the back. The lining fabric, in this case the unbleached muslin, does not have a right or wrong side, so I can leave that the way it is. I'm using a straight stitch, so I've left the default ring around the straight stitch length, and the width doesn't matter because it's a straight stitch. And I have thread in the machine that matches my fabric that's going to be the facing fabric. And I can use that for the lining too. It doesn't matter, that part doesn't have to match specifically. So I'm going to try my best to not knock this little easel over. It's holding my phone. And for this, I'm keeping a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which means the edge of the fabric should line up with the edge of the foot. And rather than watching the needle go up and down, as you learned in your sampler, you want to make sure that you are watching the seam allowance, the space between your edge of your fabric and wherever on the seam guide that you're watching. So as we learned, 1/4 inch would be on the inside of this foot, 1/2 inch is on the outside of the foot. So I'm keeping a 1/2 inch seam allowance on here. So I'm keeping the edge of the foot lined up with the edge of the fabric. Now for this first part, I really don't need to, I'm going to adjust that just a bit. I really don't need to back stitch at this point, because this is going to get, the ends of this will get sealed in when I complete the mask. Okay, so there's the lining has been stitched across the curved edge. And now I'm going to sew the same on the facing fabric. So again, I'm going to line up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the foot here, and that's what I'm watching. I'm not watching here, I'm watching here to make sure that I'm keeping my seam allowance consistent. And go around that curve. And again, I'm not going to back stitch there just because there we go. Just because I don't need to have that back stitch, because it will get, those seams will get tucked in as I'm completing the mask. They'll get crossed over when we complete the mask. So I'm not back stitching those at this point. So now I have my 2 pieces, and I'm ready to clip the seam allowance along this curve. So along that edge, I want to take a small shears. Okay, and this one doesn't seem to be very sharp, and I want to, I might have to get a different one, or I can just use, I want to cut the seam allowance toward this sewn row, but not into the sewn part. And I can make these approximately 1/2 inch apart. And we do this so that when the mask is turned inside out, that it has less bulk and allows it to turn more naturally on the curve. And you can see I'm cutting close to, but not all the way to the stitched line. So it should be just cuts along there. And I'm going to do the same thing to the face fabric. I'm going to cut notches all along here, about 1/2 inch apart. If you can use just the tip of your scissor, that works great. You have brand new scissors that you just received, some small ones. They're probably nice and sharp that you could just use the tip of the scissor. This one has been loved a lot, and it's not cutting quite as nicely on the tip, so I'm just using the inside part. So again, these get clipped close to the stitch line, but not all the way up to it. All right, so that part is done. So my next step will be to turn these inside out, create the curve, and get these pressed. So I'm going to go press both of these open so that the curve is, and I'll run my finger along inside there and make sure that the curve's out. And same thing with the lining. I'll fold that outward so that, of course I'll fold it when I have two hands available, so that I can get that laid nice and flat, and then I will give that a good pressing. It has the seams and the outside has the nice curve, and I did the same with the lining. The inside has the seam and the outside has the curve. So now the next step is going to be for me to attach these two together. So I'm actually going to flip the lining out, and I'm going to put these with the right side to the right side. So the clean, good side with the clean, good curve of this. I'm going to match up the center seam at the top and open the mask up flat. And I'm going to pin along this edge. And I like to pin so that the facing fabric and the mask are going, like the lining's going this way and the mask is going this way, so that it doesn't create a lot of bulk through that middle seam, because that's going to be right against your nose and you don't want that to have like a lot of weight or bulk to it on one side. So I'm just going to put a few pins in to hold that in place while I sew across the top. And I'll put a pin in here to hold the seam to the right side. I should say the correct side, because it's actually to the left on that. Okay, so I'll show you what that looks like from the inside. That's where that is all lined up together. And then on this side, and you can see that the lining is not as wide as the mask. That's because that gets folded over when we finish it. So this is now ready to sew. So I'm going to take this over to the sewing machine. And I'm going to sew across this top edge. Now in this case, again, I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So that means the outside of the foot is lined up with, or the fabric is lined up with the outside of the foot. Let's see if I can move that over there a little bit. And I'm going to sew across this top edge. Now I'm going to have to sew in a curving line to get across the nose part. So it's important that I really watch that edge of the foot and make sure that my mask stays lined up with that curve. And I can go nice and slow. So I'm starting to turn the fabric. I'm getting to the first pin, so I'm going to take that out. Now when it comes up to this part that goes over the nose, I've got 2 pins holding it in place, and I've also got these points where the edges of the mask come up, so I'm going to need to really pay attention to how that arcing line goes. I'm going to make sure that if you end up with any part of that fabric that wants to come up, make sure that lays down flat. You don't want to get that stuck in a seam. So I'm going to curve around the top, and I'm back lined up with the edge of the foot. Take out my last pin. And that one I did back up the stitch to lock it. I'm not sure why this keeps ending with the needle down, but it is. So I'm going to cut that, cut those threads. I always like to keep them cut as I sew, so it keeps my project nice and tidy. So now I want to show you what that looks like then. So this has been sewn across the curve of the top of the mask. So my next step is first to cut off these 2 points so that I have a nice curving edge. So I got that scrap out of the way. So now that's my nice curve. And now I need to clip this seam because it's, again, another curve. We want to make sure that we're not creating bulk across the bridge of your nose when you're wearing your mask. So I'm going to have to clip in close on these. right, so now I've got that edge clipped. So now I'm going to open the mask up flat like this, and I'm going to be top stitching, which basically means I'm stitching on top of fabric that's already been sewn, and I'm going to be sewing right along on top of the lining to attach this seam allowance to the lining, and I'm going to sew about 1/8 of an inch away from this sewn edge. So this is going to be a little bit more tricky. I need to pay attention to this side, so I need to watch the distance between where I'm stitching and where this line is, so I keep a nice parallel line. Now I've also got spots where this is going to get wider, so I'm going to have to open this up as I sew to get across that arch and back down the other side. So I'm going to start on this end, and then we'll make our way across with the sewing machine. Okay. So I'm on the lining. I've got my seam allowance underneath, it's laid flat, and I'm going to be sewing on top of the lining here. And I'm going to try to keep the edge of the foot lined up, the inside edge of this foot lined up with the seam that I already sewed, and try to get that to stay nice and lined up right inside there. So I'm going to keep this sewn edge lined up with the edge of the inside edge of this foot, and I'm going to sew all the way across. Now in this case I am going to back up here at the beginning to lock my stitch line, and I want to try to keep I want to make sure that I'm always checking underneath here, because I want that seam allowance to lay out toward the right, so that stays where it's going to be engaged, because I want to sew through, and I want to make sure that I'm pulling that seam all the way open so that I can see that stitch line. You can always stop and reposition your fabric. In this case I need to, because I'm getting close to that nose point. I'm going to pause there, make sure it's flat. And I'm going to lock my stitch on this end as well. And now we'll take a look at what that looks like. Just trimming my threads. All right, so now we have this top stitched across the length of the lining. And what that's going to do is that's going to allow me to go now to the ironing board and press that down. You'll have the nice edge there where the lining won't show in the front. And so I'm going to press that all the way across that curve of the bridge of the nose there. So that's my next step. So I'm going to go ahead and get that pressed. All right, so I've got that all pressed. You can see on the inside here, it makes it nice and clean, where the edge of the facing fabric ends up on the inside, keeping that front edge nice and clean so you don't see the lining where it's going to be going across the nose section of the face. So now I'm going to be top stitching across here. So now it's going to go on the outside. I'm going to have a stitch band across the front. So now back over to the sewing machine. And I like to sew this from the inside so that I can see where I am. And when I press that down, this ends up pressing over this top edge. It just naturally happens that way. So I'm going to start sewing from this outside and go all the way in. And I'm going to kind of stay almost along that, as close to being on top of that stitch line as I can. That's my guide. So I'm going to be watching my needle to stay right along with that edge, or that stitch row. And I'm going to lock my stitch this time too. And again, I've got to pay attention to the curves. Our face is not a flat area. We need to make sure we're getting the curves in. Adjust your fabric as you need to. Okay, coming around. All right, lock that stitch. Okay, cutting my seams. You can see my 2 stitch rows very close together. So that step is done. So that creates this nice little clean stitch row right across the nose, where that will fit over the face. All right, so my next step is to secure the bottom of the mask. And I'm going to flip this inside out. And I like to look at the top to see which was going in each direction. So I've got the lining should be going to my left and the face fabric should be going to the right. So when I'm down here at the base, I want to make sure that I'm in the right direction. So this is going to the right, lining is going to the left. And I'm lining up that central seam. So I want to make sure that when I'm opening this that I can see that my central seams are together. Make sure the edges of the fabric are even, and I'm going to go ahead and pin my facing fabric seam allowance down, and then on the lining side I want to make sure I get that pinned down. And I'm probably going to be sewing from the lining side, so I'm going to pin from this side. And then I'm going to put one more pin out here to this end. And then one pin out this way in this end. So 4 pins. If you need to use more, you can. So I'm going to sew across this bottom edge of the mask to attach those 2 together on this side. So that's where we're sewing next. And again, for this one, I want to make sure that I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Yeah, I'm going to do a 1/4 inch seam allowance, so that means the inside, we were doing 1/2 inch on the outside, the inside creates the 1/4 inch. And I'm going to lock on this one too. So started, I'm going to lock my stitch by going backwards, keeping the edge of the fabric lined up with the inside of that foot, and take a pin out as I get to it. Now there's a little bit of an arc when it comes to this middle section, so I want to make sure that I'm paying attention to that. So it kind of goes up, and I'm going to shift my fabric and take out my last pin. I'll get to the edge of the lining there, and I'm going to lock my stitch. So now I have it sewn across the bottom edge, and I'm ready to clip that seam. So again, just like I clipped before, I'm going to cut some notches across the bottom. That's going to allow it to turn easier and finish nicer. These are about a 1/2 inch or more apart. Okay, so now I'm clipped across there. So now I need to turn the mask right side out. So I'm just going to wiggle my fingers through, grab the edge of the mask, and pull it right side out. So I'm almost getting there. It's starting to look more like a mask. So the lining is going to be on the inside. And this will be my outside. So now I'm ready to go back to the ironing board, and I will press this bottom edge all the way across. And while I'm at the ironing board, I'm going to fold over the 1/4 inch seam, and then I'm going to fold it over by a 1/2 inch, and then I'll bring it back when I've got the sides ready, because then I'll be stitching down this edge and putting our elastic in, and we're done. So I've pressed the edges, and I just put a couple pins in to hold it in place. But I want to open this up so you can see what I pressed. Obviously I pressed along that bottom edge to make that nice and crisp, but I pressed about a 1/4 inch edge across there, and then I folded it probably close to 3/4 of an inch, maybe 5/8, I guess is more, 5/8 across the edge there. And I'm going to sew very close to this edge so that there's enough space to get a drawstring, well actually in this case a cord elastic through, and that will create the loops that go over your ears. Alright, so now I'm ready to sew both sides. I've got them pinned and ready and everything's pressed. So back to the sewing machine. And again, I'm trying to keep my stitch line very close to the, trying to keep my stitch line very close to this edge of the fabric. I want to keep it on the fold, but very, very close to the edge so that I have plenty of room to create the drawstring, or the elastic casing. I'm going to reverse my stitch here. I want to make sure it's nice and firm. Firmly attached. And sew down that edge, and I'm going to reverse my stitch there to make sure that's nice and attached and secure. Okay, so I'm not going to sew on this side now. Alright, so now I've got my mask is made, and now in order to be able to wear it, I just need to put the elastic through the casings. So I'll show that next. Alright, so I have my mask made, and I have 2 pieces of elastic that have been cut. They're 12 inches long, and I also have this tool that is going to help me pass the elastic through the casing openings. So I'm going to open, I can open the clamps by sliding this little ring up and down. So if I slide it down toward the hinge end, it opens up the teeth, and I can place the cord end in between the teeth like that. And then holding that, I'm going to slide the ring down. That holds it securely in place, so it's now got the teeth into the cord. And holding the mask, I can pass the hinge end through the casing and out the other side, and that pulls my cord through. So now I've got the cord through. I can release the hinge, and I can put the 2 ends together and tie a knot. And that should hold the elastic securely. Now I'll have to try it on and make sure that that's the right length, and once I determine that it is the right length, then I can just slide the knot into the casing, so if I ever needed to readjust the length, I could. So let's do that one more time for the other side. So again, putting the claw part into the elastic, holding that end, sliding the ring down to secure the claw on the elastic. Slide the hinge end through the casing and out the other side. I'm going to release the claw end by sliding the ring up. Line up my two ends. And then just simply tie a knot to secure the ear ring. And then I can slide the knot into the casing so that it's not seen. Now, there's the finished mask, front and back, and I can see if it fits, and I can adjust the earrings accordingly. If I need it tighter, I can make it smaller by tightening the knot smaller. Hope that helps. It should answer any questions you have. Certainly ask if you hit any snags.